Hi, welcome to the Dr. Giobbi podcast. This is episode 7. This week we're going to be looking at the romantic and existential reaction to empiricism. So we're going to begin our exploration of romanticism with Rousseau and move on to Schopenhauer and then existentialism, including Christian existentialism with Kierkegaard and secular existentialism with Friedrich Nietzsche. That's episode 7 on the Dr. Giobbi podcast. After the Dark Ages and the rising of the Enlightenment, the privileging of logic and reason and rationality and empiricism, it was felt that we were in an enlightened period and we had left behind the superstitious, dogmatic world of the Middle Ages. The idea of empiricism, of reason and logic and rationality became almost fetishized, became privileged above all other forms of knowledge, and it became to dominate intellectual life with the phrase "knowledge is power." But of course, power always means that there is a dominant and a submissive position. Power is used to force others into submission. Well, the problem came about that thinkers began to react against this rationality, against this maybe severe preoccupation with objectivity and rationality. The Enlightenment thinkers devalued the emotional and irrational aspects of the human condition, actually stating that these irrational and emotional aspects were somehow inferior to the logical and rational and well-reasoned decision-making. The Enlightenment view of the human being was as a rational machine looking to unlock the laws of the clockwork mechanism of human rationality. Romanticism really reacted against this, as did existentialism, we'll see. Re-embracing a Dionysian kind of ecstatic personal existence rather than an Apollonian logical existence. So in the 18th century and early 19th century, a group of philosophers were reacting against the empiricists, and they were saying that there was more importance or equal importance in irrational components of human nature, in things like feelings, emotions, intuitions, and instincts. And these individual philosophers felt that there was too much emphasis on sensation and association that the empiricists put forth. These philosophers were called the Romantics. So romantic philosophy is based on a focus on irrational feelings, emotions, intuitions, and instincts. So whereas the empiricist felt that rational thinking was the way to the good life, for the Romantics, the rational thinking led us astray, and that we should trust our intuition, our gut feeling, our emotional drives. It was irrationality that we should embrace and to follow. For the Romanticist, the empiricist was interested in viewing the human as a mechanical, unfeeling machine. Schneider, in 1998, described the Romantic as a desire to return to the lived world and to a childlike openness. This was the spirit of the Romantic. So it's not so much that the empiricists didn't speak of emotion, but they felt that emotion was something that needed to be controlled by rational thought. Emotions would be destructive if it weren't for rationality. For the 19th century Romantic philosopher, the good life was living true to oneself. JeanJacques Rousseau was born in 1712 in Geneva, Switzerland, and he died in 1778. He's considered to be the first of the Romantic philosophers. It turns out that Rousseau, as a young man, developed bit of a fetish in which he would expose himself to women in alleyways and whatnot, in public spaces. And one time he was actually caught and apprehended by a man as he was exposing himself to a group of women, and Rousseau thought fast and told the individual that he had a brain disorder that made him do these things uncontrollably. So a very peculiar kind of sexual life as a young man. When Rousseau was 15 years old, he started an affair with a 28-year-old tutor, and the affair lasted for 10 years. She was educated in philosophy, religion, literature, and they remained lovers until Rousseau was 25. In 1745, Rousseau met a maid in a hotel in Paris, and he lived with her for the rest of his life. They had 5 children together, and all 5 of those children were sent to an orphanage to be raised. He spent the rest of his life with this woman, and he also was known to be quite a womanizer, and he remained a womanizer throughout his entire relationship. So Rousseau had no formal education. It's when he moved to Paris at the age of 30 that he joined a group of Parisian intellectuals in the cafe life. And in 1756, he left Paris, moved to the country, and by 1762, he had written his 2 most famous works, The Social Contract and Emile. Both of these were written and were highly controversial at the time. The books were so profound, so controversial, that he was actually condemned in Paris, and an arrest warrant was issued in Geneva, his hometown. So he spent about 4 years as a refugee. But finally, in 1765, David Hume, the philosopher David Hume, offered Rousseau safe haven in England. He spent a few years in England and eventually returned to Paris, and it's suspected that he committed suicide. The beginning of his book, The Social Contract, Rousseau begins with this statement: "Man is born free, and yet we see him everywhere in chains." His reasoning here was that governments at the time were built on a faulty notion that humans needed to be governed. In fact, Rousseau felt that man was born free, was born natural, and was corrupted by man-made governments. For Rousseau, the only government that should exist would be a government that allowed an individual to express their own free will, to live to their fullest potential naturally. Rousseau, in his own words, "Let us lay it down as an incontrovertible rule that the first impulses of human nature are always right. There is no original sin in the human heart." If you remember back to when we discussed Hobbes, you'll recall that Hobbes felt that the human was born self-serving and even destructive, and that society was needed to temper the human drive for personal satisfaction. Well, Rousseau had the exact opposite perspective. Rousseau felt that we were born noble savages, that we were born with a pure spirit, and it was government and politics and economics that actually corrupted us, and that our goal should be to free ourselves from these things and return to the blissful, noble, savage state that we were born into. Rousseau viewed humans as social animals that were driven primarily not by selfishness, but by compassion and cooperation. Interestingly, we find in contemporary evolutionary psychology and contemporary neuroscience the evidence that cooperation or competitiveness is not necessarily a basic human predisposition, but one that is fostered, one that is encouraged and fed within in individuals. worldview. Rousseau was interested in his social contract to discover just what would have to be done, just what kind of a government would have to be put in place to have the best possible social situation. Rousseau said that we had to privilege the general will over the individual will. The general will is the will of the group. So what Rousseau was pushing towards was more of a collectivist culture rather than an individualist culture. So the private will would be a will that was self-interested, and the general will would be a will that is interested in the well-being of the greater whole, the group. In Rousseau's own words, the social contract is when each of us places in common his person and all of his power under the supreme direction of the general will. And as one body, we all receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. So it's actually seeing oneself as the whole rather than seeing one as an individual within the group. This is quite similar to a Buddhist or an Eastern philosophy of collectivism, in which the one is not distinguishable from the whole or the other. Rousseau's criticism of the education system was as harsh as his criticisms of the political situations of his day. Listen to his words: God makes all things good, man meddles with them, and they become evil. He forces one soil to yield the products of another, one tree to bear another's fruit. He confuses and confounds time, place, and natural conditions. He mutilates his dog, his horse, and his slave. He destroys and defaces all things. He loves all that is deformed and monstrous. He will have nothing as nature made it, not even man himself, who must learn his paces like a saddle horse, and be shaped to his master's taste like the trees in his garden. What we find here in Rousseau's treatise Emile on education is a critique of sentencing children to 12 or more years of schooling in order to make all that is noble in them into something distorted, something that's culturally or socially acceptable. For Rousseau, education should not be highly structured. It shouldn't consist of dumping information into someone's head. Instead, it should create situations of curiosity and wonderment and draw on a child's natural abilities and interests and to nurture those individual interests. Maybe something akin to a Montessori type education in contemporary times. For Rousseau, the ideal classroom would be a student and a teacher working together, a tutor, going into nature, allowing the child to freely explore his or her curiosity, and for the tutor to ask the correct questions to encourage more curiosity and more exploration. The tutor or the teacher is a guide rather than an instructor. Rousseau, in his own words, every mind has its own form, in accordance with which it must be controlled, and the success of the pains taken depends largely on the fact that he is controlled in this way and no other. O wise man, take time to observe nature. Watch your scholar well before you say a word to him. First leave the germ of his character free to show itself. Do not constrain him in anything, the better to see him as he really is. The wise physician does not hastily give prescriptions at first sight, but he studies the constitution of the sick man before he prescribes anything. The treatment is begun later, but the patient is cured while the hasty doctor kills him. Perhaps one of the most romantic of the romantic thinkers was Johann Wolfgang von Gerta. Gerta was born in 1749 and died in 1832. He really spanned the 18th and 19th centuries, and he's really known as a very fiery and emotionally centered writer and poet and thinker. He was a scientist, he was a philosopher, he was a poet, and an author. Gerta proposed that life consisted of opposing forces such as love and hate, life and death, good and evil. The goal of life should be to embrace these forces rather than to fight them or deny them, to fully live them in their most violent capacities. He encouraged us to embrace the dark sides of life, to embrace fear and angst and anger and anxiety and loneliness. We see here the germs of existentialism, but he really is the pinnacle of romanticism. Gerta wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther, 1774, which was a novella, a little novel story about the romantic ideology. It actually resulted in a number of suicides over history. Another of his great works is Faust, which is what one does, what sacrifices or deals one makes to accomplish one's passions and desires. In 1810, Gerta proposed a theory of colors, science of colors in 1810, and it's was opposed greatly to Newton's model, Newton's theory, and in actuality it worked. It has a complete different conceptualization of how color works, and it's something that now physicists are exploring and seeking as an alternative view from the Newtonian view of what color and light is. Gerta embraced phenomenology. This is the idea that one studies one's experience of something. What is phenomenology? This is a big word that we're going to be wrestling with in this now the second half of this course. Phenomenology is being aware of the individual experience of a phenomenon. This is having a phenomenological awareness of what one is feeling in relationship to one's context. The entire phenomenological milieu that is occurring in an individual at a given time. Let's listen to the words of Carl Jung on Gerta. In my youth, around 1890, I was unconsciously caught up by this spirit of the age and had no methods in hand of extricating myself from it. Faust struck a chord in me and pierced me through in a way that I could not but regard as personal. Most of all, it awakened in me the problems of opposites, of good and evil, of mind and matter, of light and darkness. That's Carl Jung in 1963 discussing Goethe's influence. In part 2 of episode 7, we'll be exploring Arthur Schopenhauer and the height of romantic philosophy. Thanks for listening. The German romantic philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said that every day we wake up and it's all downhill from there. This is a very freeing pessimism, and we explore this today in episode 7, part 2 of the history of psychology, romantic philosophy. Arthur Schopenhauer, the pessimist. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in Danzig and died in 1860. Danzig is now a city in Poland, but at the time it was a city in Germany. Schopenhauer inherited quite a bit of wealth. His father was a banker and his mother was a famous novelist. His father passed away. It's thought that he committed suicide, and after this, the mother took the wealth and created a very luxurious intellectual salon where the artists and intellectual luminaries of the day gathered. One of those luminaries was Gerta, who became friends with Schopenhauer. Although Schopenhauer's relationship with his mother was a very difficult one, and eventually she threw him out of the house, and they didn't speak again for the last 50 years of his life. Schopenhauer was teaching at the same time that Hegel was teaching, and he would do something a little funny to compete with Hegel. He would schedule his lectures at the same time just to see if he could get more students to attend his lectures than Hegel's lectures. Unfortunately, he didn't do so well, and the students did prefer Hegel over Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer eventually gave up teaching. Schopenhauer claimed that his most influential thinkers were Kant and the Indian and Persian philosophers, particularly the Upanishads. In his study, he had two busts, one of Kant and one of the Buddha. Schopenhauer wrote extensively on the will, which he identified as sexual appetite, but he never married. He did have a rather healthy sexual life, though, mostly with prostitutes and the servant girls as well. One of the servant girls bore him a child, and he also pursued young chorus girls, and he was quite a romantic in the sexual sense as well. Schopenhauer's most famous text, a 2-volume work called The World as Will and Representation, was published in 1818. Schopenhauer was only 30 years old. And although the World as Will and Representation has come to be known as a masterpiece in Western philosophy, it barely sold any copies during Schopenhauer's lifetime. So you might recall Kant's distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world, the idea that there's a world of things in itself, a noumenal reality, but that our experience was of the phenomenology of the noumenal. The phenomenal world was our direct experience. Well, Schopenhauer equated the noumenal world with the will. And he said the noumenal world, this thing in itself, was at its essence the will to survive. We might today even look at this as biological drives and the human will towards eros, towards propagating life and towards survival. It's a very genetic, deeply hardwired human experience. It's a series of unending needs and fulfillments. So that's the noumenal aspect. That's the will. The world is will and representation. Well, representation is the phenomenal world. So what he's basically saying here is, as Kant said, that there's a noumenal and a phenomenal world, Schopenhauer is reiterating this in the title of his text, The World as Will and Representation, phenomenological experience of the will. This is even more fascinating to realize that Eastern philosophy informed this as equally as Kant did. The Vedic Upanishads of the Hindu text, Schopenhauer mentions in the beginning of The World as Will and Representation that before you even start his text, you should read the Upanishads. So for Schopenhauer, the drive towards self-preservation, physical, emotional, personal, this is the driving motivation of all behavior. If we orient this, if we understand all questions as oriented towards how does this solve the problem of survival, then we really have Schopenhauer's point of view. The will serves survival and propagation, survival of the species. As we'll see, Freud was greatly influenced by Schopenhauer. In fact, Schopenhauer pointed out that the will was largely irrational, and that we reacted to this will and behaved and thought and felt in reaction to very irrational pressures. And the irrational were actually much stronger than any rational thinking was. Schopenhauer really laid out the framework for the pleasure principle of Freud. Schopenhauer pointed out that needs arise, desires build, they're satisfied momentarily, and then rise and build again, and life is this endless succession of desire, satisfaction, desire, satisfaction. Schopenhauer's own words, all willing springs from lack. from deficiency, and thus from suffering. Fulfillment brings this to an end. Yet for one wish that is fulfilled, there remain at least 10 that are denied. No attained object of willing can give a satisfaction that lasts and no longer declines, but it is always like the alms thrown to a beggar, which reprieves him today so that his misery may be prolonged until tomorrow. Therefore, so long as our consciousness is filled by our will, so long as we are given up to the throng of desires with its constant hopes and fears, so long as we are the subject of willing, we never obtain lasting happiness or peace. This is very similar to the Vedic and the Buddhist tradition of giving up attachment, desire to things. The 20th century existential psychologist Viktor Frankl coined a term called Sunday neurosis, which he actually took from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer said that we spend 6 days a week attempting to satisfy our needs, and then we spend Sunday being bored. This is an example of Schopenhauer's pessimism. When our needs are met, we experience boredom. For Schopenhauer, intelligence was a matter of increased consciousness. And he said that the more intelligent a being, the more suffering takes place. This is not only true in the animal world, but also amongst humans. Those who are more intelligent suffer more. He also said that you can tell someone's intelligence by their sensitivity to loud noises. People who don't have much to think about don't mind loud distractions. But when an individual is intelligent and has much on their mind to consider and contemplate, then they're very disturbed by loud noises. Really, the idea of the romantic suffering genius comes from Schopenhauer. His idea was that with great sensitivity and intelligence and consciousness comes great suffering, but it's a noble suffering, an admirable suffering, what one does for as an artist or as the life of the mind. Schopenhauer also said that an individual's intelligence is often marked by their ability to be alone with themselves. That individuals who are more gregarious are not so inclined to think. He also was very adamant in saying that most pain and suffering comes from interactions with others. As the pessimist, Schopenhauer proposed a view of life as a postponement of death. Every day is just one day postponement till the final day of death. In his own words, the life of our body is only a constantly prevented dying, an ever deferred death. Every breath we draw wards off the death that constantly impinges on us. In this way we struggle with it every second, and again at longer intervals, through every meal we eat, every sleep we take, every time we warm ourselves, and so on. Ultimately, death must triumph, for by birth it has already become our lot, and it plays with this prey only for a while before swallowing it up. However, we continue our life with great interests and much solicitude as long as possible, just as we blow out a soap bubble as long as it enlarges possible, although with the perfect certainty that it will burst. Schopenhauer points out that most people don't cling to life because they enjoy it so much. They cling to life because they fear death so much. We really find here the idea of transcendence. As the Buddhists put it, nirvana. Schopenhauer pointed out that regardless of all of this pain and suffering, that we should work through sublimation and through denial and embrace it and rise above it to transcend the situation of our existence. So Freud used the idea of sublimating anxieties into art and culture. And this is exactly from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer said, how do we deal with our irrational? How do we cope with this and turn it into something positive, something life-enhancing? Well, he said we do it through sublimation. That is not getting too wrapped up in needs and getting more wrapped up in non-sexual, unselfish, sympathetic love, Platonic philosophy, and art and poetry and creativity, that this was the way of conquering the will. If we merely ignore the will, and this is another path one can take to deny the will, but if we merely ignore it, Schopenhauer said that we're really coming close to the idea of nothingness. And this for him is a very, very difficult position to be in. This is coming very close to non-existence. Maybe this is what we experience in boredom or existential nausea, as we'll understand in the terminology of Sartre. And this idea Schopenhauer put forth of the will to survive is exactly what keeps someone in a terminal disease finding it difficult to take their own life. It's this inborn will towards survival. For Schopenhauer, the main purpose of life is to gain insight into one's own existence. This will be reiterated famously by the 20th century existentialists, and the answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, is to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? So for Schopenhauer, one confronts this question, and suicide merely evades it, although it is the ultimate act of free will. Suicide is a way of getting out of the question rather than confronting the question. Schopenhauer also described the unconscious mind, which it went on to influence Freud's understanding of the psyche. Listen to Schopenhauer's own words from 1851. In an excellent parable, Proclus, the Neoplatonist, points out how in every town the mob dwells side by side with those who are rich and distinguished. So too, in every man, he never be noble and dignified. There is in the depths of his nature a mob of low and vulgar desires which constitute him an animal. It will not do to let this mob revolt or even so much a peep forth from its hiding place. So this is really the idea of irrational, unconscious desires that exist even in the most cultivated of us. Schopenhauer also went on to describe consciousness as the mere surface of our minds, and of this as of the globe we do not know the interior but only the crust. Now, Freud was careful to point out that Schopenhauer had been there before him, but Freud was also very clear that he arrived at these ideas independently of Schopenhauer before reading Schopenhauer. And this is still left up to scholars to argue how true that is, if Freud actually took this out of Schopenhauer or arrived at it and then found it in Schopenhauer later. Regardless, Freud did acknowledge Schopenhauer. In the next part of episode 7, we'll be turning to existentialism, the birth of existentialism, with Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. That's episode 7, part 3 of the Dr. Giobbi podcast. Thanks for listening. Hi, this is Dr. Giobbi. Welcome to the podcast. Today we'll be looking at secular existentialism and Friedrich Nietzsche. That's today on the Dr. Giobbi podcast. Friedrich Nietzsche was born near Leipzig in 1844, and he died in 1900 at a very young age. And what makes Nietzsche very interesting is that his childhood was one of turmoil, much like many of the thinkers that we've encountered. His father was a Lutheran minister,
and he was the grandson of two clergymen. When he was 5 years old, his father died, and he grew up in a household consisting of his mother, his sister, and his two aunts, and his grandmother. So he was raised by a group of women with a very Protestant background. Nietzsche really was the quintessential romantic intellectual. We're talking here about someone who not only wrote philosophy rejecting the models of philosophical writing. He wrote in aphorisms, short little bursts of thoughts, complete books with just a couple sentence thoughts, just to spark the reader into their own thinking instead of directing them to think in a certain way through narrative. He also wrote through narratives, through stories and allegories. This was a return to some kind of earlier type of pre-logical philosophy. In fact, this was a return to the Dionysian, the pre-Socratic, or even the pre-Platonic, as he would call it, mythos of philosophy. Nietzsche was also a composer of music, a good close friend and later antagonist of Richard Wagner. If there is one thing I can say about Friedrich Nietzsche is that he's very much misunderstood. Most of what we hear about Nietzsche, even in basic courses of introduction to philosophy class, are often really poor misrepresentations of Nietzsche. Often those who discuss Nietzsche or quote him out of context have never really read Nietzsche. And there is a distinction intellectually between reading about someone and reading their work from their own pen. And this is something I think in our understanding of Nietzsche we have to really take into consideration. Nietzsche was very faithful not to his degrees or to his classes, but to thinkers that he admired. When he entered into Bonn University, he was very dedicated to Friedrich Nietzsche, who, when this professor, when he transferred from the University of Bonn to the University of Leipzig, Nietzsche left the University of Bonn and went to the University of Leipzig to join this professor. He was always interested in what the individual had to say more than what the course content necessarily was. Nietzsche really sets an example of the contemporary romantic philosopher. This is an individual who, at the age of 24, was accepted to become professor of classical philology, which is the study of ancient languages, ideas, and word origins, at the University of Basel. He taught there for 10 years, and at the age of 35, he left. Now, most say he retired, but in fact, he did resign because he felt that there was no thinking going on in the university. As a matter of fact, in many places, he pointed out that if one really wanted to think, they had to free themselves from the university. And this is the first philosopher we see that either holds himself up in his writing studio in Switzerland, or, as we'll see later with other philosophers of this tradition, write in the social writing of the cafes of Paris and Prague and other places throughout the world. This is really a new type of intellectual, one that is educated in the university system, but then liberates oneself from the handcuffs that often come with intellectual atmosphere in the university system. In fact, most of Nietzsche's books were written after his academic career, after he left being a professor. Some of his books include The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music in 1872, Untimely Meditations, 1876, Human, All Too Human in 1878, The Gay Science in 1882, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1885, Beyond Good and Evil in 1886, Towards the Genealogy of Morals in 1887, The Twilight of the Idols in 1889, The Antichrist in 1895, and Nietzsche contra Wagner, 1895, The Will to Power. In 1904, The Will to Power, his incredible collection of aphorisms, and Ecce Homo, 1908. In 1882, when Nietzsche was 37 years old, he met an intelligent, beautiful, and very, very saucy Russian girl named Luz Salome. Nietzsche thought of Lou as his intellectual partner, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life pursuing intellectual work with her. Nietzsche proposed to her twice, and she said no twice, and this very much devastated Nietzsche. He, in the aftermath of this rejection, he started working on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and this book is very autobiographical for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche pointed out that thinking isn't logical. Philosophy isn't something that people do as some sort of mechanical method. That philosophy was completely autobiographical. One wrote their life in their philosophy. Lou Salome went on to marry an intellectual named Friedrich Karl Andreas, and she then became fascinated by the work of Freud. She became one of Freud's closest friends and disciples. It's a very interesting recounting of this story in Irvin Yalom's book, When Nietzsche Wept. Very powerful and important story to understand Nietzsche through. In early January of 1889, Nietzsche saw a horse-drawn cab in the street, and the owner of the cab was beating the horse. And Nietzsche, in sympathy, tearfully embraced the horse and pleaded with the man to stop, placing himself between the man and the horse. And he wept and collapsed and fell onto the street. He was then admitted into an asylum. Nietzsche seems to have suffered a great mental breakdown at this time. He thought that he was the Duke of Cumberland, the Kaiser, Dionysus, and the crucified. He even thought he was God. And it's felt that this was due to syphilis that he had contracted earlier in his life. Nietzsche spent the last 11 years of his life in his home, being cared for by his sister. He died just a few weeks before his 56th birthday on August 25th, 1900. And he was buried in his hometown in a cemetery church where his father had baptized him. Nietzsche felt that the best philosophy was art, and that the human condition expressed through art had two sides, an Apollonian and a Dionysian side of nature, aspect of human nature. The Apollonian side of human nature desired rationality and tranquility and predictability, orderliness. And we might think of this today as like the left-brained person. The Dionysian aspect of the human being would be like the right brain. This is the irrational, the attraction to creativity and chaos and passion and dynamic experiences. Nietzsche said that the best art, the best philosophy, embraced both of these two into a functional whole, the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Nietzsche said, don't just live. Live with passion. And living with passion, moving towards this, was the movement towards what Nietzsche called the superhuman, the Übermensch. Nietzsche, in fact, viewed himself as a psychologist. In his own words, that a psychologist without equal speaks from my writing is perhaps the first insight reached by a good reader, a reader as I deserve him. This illustrates Nietzsche's idea that his philosophy is really what we call a life philosophy, not an academic, dead philosophy, but a living, working life philosophy. Before Freud, Nietzsche's psychology, like Freud's later psychology, was interested in helping individuals to achieve the goal of being powerful, to master their irrational impulses, and to become more creative and more spontaneous and healthful in living. This is the beginning of what we know as the existential psychological movement. Freud described a superego. This was the individual's falling into society's rules, all the social pressures that we grow up with, not questioning that we don't have to follow them. There's nothing saying we have to follow these, incorporating them into ourselves as the form of guilt. Well, Freud said that the best way is to manage to live within these social these social boundaries. Nietzsche rejected this. Nietzsche said the Superman rejects these social boundaries and lives from within oneself. That's a sign of the Übermensch, of the superhuman. Nietzsche had no use for church or social convention. It was up to the individual to live deliberately. Nietzsche said, "We are responsible for ourselves to create our own existence." Nietzsche pointed out that we're only potentially free. Freedom itself is a choice, and we have to choose freedom. The difference between freedom and slavery for Nietzsche is a matter of choice. Everyone who wishes to become free must become free through his own endeavor. Freedom does not fall into any man's lap as a miraculous gift. In 1882, Nietzsche published a text called The Gay Science, and in it is one of his most famous quotes, his quote, "God is dead." And Nietzsche tells the story of a madman who comes down from the mountains, and this is a hermit, someone who's been thinking, a philosopher in the hills, comes down into society, into the agora, into the center square, and begins proclaiming, "God is dead and we have killed him. What shall we do? God is dead." And when the people ignore him and laugh at him and jeer at him, he said, "I come too early. My time is not yet. The deed is still more remote to them than the remotest stars, and yet they done it to themselves." What Nietzsche was talking about here was the fact that God was killed by scientists and philosophers of his day. The idea here is not that is man just one of God's mistakes, or is God just one of man's mistakes. Nietzsche was really warning us of what happens to a society that relies too much on science and philosophy, too much on the rational, and forsakes the spiritual. Nietzsche was really contemplating here where we would get our morality from, where the rudder of humankind would be without God. Science, evolutionary theory, all these things took purpose from man. Man was displaced as the great center, the pinnacle of creation. And now it was left to man to find meaning for himself. This is the birth of existentialism, man creating purposefulness for himself. Nietzsche saw a great danger in a human that was left with the view that it was nothing more than a pursuit of survival, an evolutionary survivability or sexual reproduction. This is a world with a loss of enchantment, a world that was at a loss for purposefulness of being human. And Nietzsche said that it was up to us to develop that purposefulness, that the responsibility was our own. We could no longer hand the task off to religion or the gods. Nietzsche saw the positivists, the scientists, those who would come to study psychophysics and physiology as individuals who were looking to they were necrophiles. They were interested in killing things in life. They're interested in destroying anything that would have purposefulness in living. Nietzsche said that biology itself showed that Earth is simply a medium-sized ball of clay revolving around one of the hundreds of billions of suns. There was nothing special about being human, about being in the world. And this is really something that Nietzsche embraced as the foundation of what we today call existentialism. And Nietzsche, like most of the postmodern philosophers, referred to science as a metaphysics. Science itself was no different than religion. It was a belief system, a metaphysical belief system. We're left in what Nietzsche called a cosmic tabula rasa. This is without any kind of transcending principles or forces to guide us. Nietzsche said there are no abstract truths, no metaphysical big picture truths to be found by any of us, but there are individual truths, individual perspectives that we must forge in our own lives. All philosophy for Nietzsche is a great confession of its author. In 1878, Nietzsche wrote a book, Human, All Too Human, and one of the things he discussed in this book was the idea of convictions. Convictions are the belief in the possession of absolute truth on any matter of knowledge. He said that this is the absolute sign of ignorance when someone has a sense of they're knowing the truth. That conviction is it's when people stop thinking. A contemporary thinker recently expressed this to me by saying that today in university we teach knowing instead of thinking. Nietzsche would say, stop having the conviction of knowing something and seek out thinking instead. Nietzsche pointed out that, of course, this is very difficult for many to do because giving up one's sense of knowing, their conviction, with that they give up their sense of eternal salvation, especially if it's a religiously based. For Nietzsche, convictions led to fanaticism. They were not opinions, they were fanatic beliefs. Here's Nietzsche in his own words. It is not the struggle of opinions that has made history so turbulent, but the struggle of belief in opinions. That is to say, of convictions. If all those who thought so highly of their convictions, who made sacrifices of all kinds for them, are spared neither honor, body, nor life in their service, had only devoted half of their energy to examining their right to adhere to this or that conviction, and by what road they arrived at it, how peaceable would the history of mankind now appear, how much more knowledge would be there. It turns out that Nietzsche was a passionate reader of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the sage of Concord, the New England transcendentalist. Nietzsche traveled with a copy of Emerson's essays, a German copy of Emerson's essays. We see many parallels between the earlier Ralph Waldo Emerson's transcendental movement and Nietzsche's German transcendentalism. One of those things is the will to power. According to Nietzsche, the answer to the problem is to look within oneself, the will to power. This is written by Nietzsche as the sense of living to one's own internal star. In Emerson, it was expressed as self-reliance. For Nietzsche, just like for Emerson, one had to develop their sense of conviction to oneself, to listen to that inner voice. Nietzsche called the inner voice the will to power. Emerson called the inner voice that one's star, one's orientation, to become attuned to that star, to that orientation, to listen to one's inner voice and to be true to oneself, to live truly to oneself. That's the essence of existentialism. It's the essence of Nietzsche's will to power. It's also the essence of Emerson's self-reliance. For Nietzsche, everything that is good or bad, morality, is all centered around an individual's sense of will. What is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power in man. The will to power, power itself. What is bad? Everything that is born of weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power is growing, the resistance is overcoming. Now, Nietzsche wasn't talking about making others submit. That's not the kind of power that Nietzsche is talking about. This word power, this translation of from the German, is not power meaning others submit to one's will. It means more of a self-actualization, the stuff that Rollo May or Abraham Maslow will come to celebrate as a self-actualized, or Emerson would say a transcendent individual. The will to power is not a power over others, it's a power over one's own self. And when one masters this will to power, we become superhuman. This is often called Superman in English, or Übermenschen in German. This is from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the overman. Emerson incidentally talked about the oversoul, someone who is transcended and self-actualized. I teach you the Superman. Man is something that should be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? What is the ape to men? A laughing stock or a painful embarrassment? And just so shall man be to the Superman, a laughing stock or a painful embarrassment. You have made your way from worm to man, and much in you is still worm. Behold, I teach you the Superman, the superhuman is the meaning of the earth. Let your will say, the superhuman shall be the meaning of the earth. I entreat you, my brothers, remain true to the earth, and do not believe those who speak to you in superterrestrial hopes. They are poisoners, whatever they know, whether they know it or not. They are despisers of life, atrophying and self-poisoned men, of whom the earth is weary, so let them be gone. Nietzsche's talking about embracing not the Superman as it's translated, but the superhuman, rising above being merely human. We should take a moment here to really discuss some great misunderstandings of Nietzsche. In my experience as an intellectual, one of the greatest misreadings and misunderstandings of Nietzsche is a popular one by an author whose name is Alyssa Rosenbaum. She changed her pen name to Ein Rand. The author, Ein Rand, Alyssa Rosenbaum, wrote a few books that have become extremely popular amongst certain people in America. Very well-selling books, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. These two texts are very appealing to individuals who have not studied philosophy beyond maybe a course in undergraduate philosophy. In my opinion, this work is a very gross misreading of Nietzsche. Scholars of Nietzsche, thinkers, intellectuals across the board would definitely dismiss this as a very myopic and misunderstood reading, a very self-centered reading of Nietzsche's works. What she proposes is a selfishness that Nietzsche himself would have absolutely rejected. There are cultural and political reasons that Rosenbaum's writing is popular today in America, particularly among certain political groups. I say go to Nietzsche in his own words, go to Emerson, and then go to Nietzsche. If you really want to understand this idea of living to one's greatest potential, or the will to power. In our next segment, we'll be looking at the psychophysicist of the 19th century, that's early psychophysical psychology of the 19th century, on the Dr. Giobbi podcast. Thanks for listening.